So this is kind of a test, but also a valid kind of thing in itself. And we're going to talk about anti-work as a thing. As I was saying, I'm not an expert in anti-work as such in the kind of philosophical sense, but I do know something about work and not working. And Adam is here, and he suggested this, and I think he probably has a bit more to say. I think he's a bit more pro anti-work than me, although probably works harder in his day-to-day life. So, Adam, do you want to start and tell us why you thought of this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think I am a little bit pro anti-work, or I would actually probably frame it more as post-work, but we can get into that in a bit. The reason why I thought this would be a fun thing to look through is I don't love Reddit. I use it very occasionally, but I know that this subreddit r/anti-work has blown up over the last couple months, particularly in the US. I do think it's probably a little US or global north focused, but we can get into that too. With this whole thing called the Great Resignation, which has happened in the last couple months. And it's people refusing to work, quitting their jobs. And I've had a bunch of normies show me memes from this, like, just like hanging out at the coffee shop or whatever. And people come up to me and they're like, hey, I thought you would like this. And they show me a meme and they're like, yeah, have you seen this subreddit anti-work? It's hilarious. And just the fact that so many people are sharing this, and it was Reddit's fastest growing community, I think is important to look at. But I also think it touches on quite a bit of the dynamics that we're seeing right now and some of the bigger debates that need to be had amongst the left themselves and like the broader working class. So yeah, I know this won't all be good, but I don't think it'll all be bad as well. I think there is going to be some like quit your job porn, which is cathartic for the soul, has a moment of solidarity, yes, but I don't think it's actual theory or actual praxis. So we're going to try to navigate, I think, all of that. Like look at the memes, laugh at them, critique them maybe, but then also kind of discuss the broader implications and broader ideas that may have led to something like anti-work.
Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about anti-work, as I would put it. So it's going to be an interesting talk. I mean, I associate it a lot with accelerationism, and that book by Cernicek and Williams, in which they talk about kind of an anti-work or no working movement, I think, and they link it to tech accelerationism and the idea that automation will free us from work. So I just have a lot of questions about that generally. So I'm a bit kind of, I mean, I just don't really trust the ruling elite that they would just let us not work in the event that automation makes work unnecessary. I think they still have us doing something, or they just find us expendable. So I think that's a big gap in the theory, but I don't think it's really so relevant to what we're looking at now. And what we're looking at now, I mean, maybe it is, and maybe you can tell me what you think about that. But what we're looking at now reminds me a lot more, actually, in its tone to the kind of slacker movement of the 90s and associative movements of people who were like adjacent to either to like grunge or to, I mean, grunge was a kind of a very kind of pop, kind of almost pop thing. So I think also more to the kind of traveller movements and anti-road building movements in the UK and rave movements. A lot of that kind of revolved around not working and claiming benefits and trying to make up some kind of alternative economy. So I see that as kind of positive. I can kind of get into that, just refusal to work, but I don't really buy it. I don't really buy not working, in the sense that Cernicek and Williams explained it.
Yeah, that's interesting because I haven't read that book, but I've read a little excerpts from it, and I'm somewhat familiar with the argument. I find myself more akin to like that than the earlier forms of anti-work, because I do know the theory dates back to early anarchist movements even. And even Marxist movements as well. I mean, I think you could classify the situationist and autonomist, some of their stuff as anti-work. I think We recently read an essay on liberation, which I think has some elements that kind of congeal with that, but with the more accelerationist, left accelerationist type. But you are absolutely right that automation inside of capitalism would not lead to less or no work by any means. And, you know, that's one of the main critiques I think that the more theoretical approach of anti-work tries to get at, is saying that we should be working less, but we're not. Like, you know, we've invented all these labor-saving devices and machines and stuff, but yet we're just exploited just in different levels, and we have to continue to work. So anti-work by itself can't be the answer. I think in the long run, it has to be paired with other types of things, which could involve degrowth, which could involve automation, you know, all sorts of stuff. And it has to consider more than just your city or your country. You know, there's a lot to think about when you consider the whole globe in there. But
well, that is one of the things. Yeah, obviously that when people speak about kind of Western automation and the idea that we'll soon be in a position to not work, it doesn't consider the fact that we'll be reliant on goods still from the global South and developing world. I mean, someone has to make. I mean, I suppose one of the arguments is that the goods will literally just be made by robots. But we seem so far from that now, and so much in a position where, you know, whatever level of automation we get here, there's going to be a high degree of, you know, work-oriented activity still in countries like obviously China. I mean, it depends. I suppose that China can accelerate so fast that they might be the first country to experience no work, and we'll be working for them, doing little bits and pieces that they can't have fully automated. Who knows? But it doesn't seem to be like a global consensus or situation now where we can move forward together all into universal basic income and no work. So we face an issue which we face anyway, and that's just principally that the left, the social democrat and democratic socialist left in the West often doesn't really consider the position of non-Western workers. And not just social democrat and democratic socialists, but you know, across the board. I think it's even a problem with communists often.
Oh yeah, for sure. I do have to say, I do know that there is in China a movement that takes this into account. That is like an anti-work movement. They don't call it that, but there are a lot of youth in China right now that are like kind of refusing, you know, careerism, and are saying basically like their life matters, their inner life and their happiness and their social life matters more than just getting ahead and never, you know, having rest.
Yeah, I mean, and they reminded me of like the slacker movement of the 90s. I'm not really familiar with what that really meant, if they were like texts and stuff. I think it was more of an American thing, but you know, just a movement of almost like mall rats, but slightly more sophisticated mall rats, like kind of grungy people who just wanted to play guitar and smoke pot and do nothing. And there wasn't really like a strong sophistication behind it. I mean, there's Chinese. I mean, I saw an article on this. These Chinese teenagers don't quite seem like that, but I mean, they seem a bit like, fuck it, I can't be bothered with a career, you know, rather than having some kind of like strong, you know, philosophical framework there, which I quite like. That, you know, I think that is as honest as anything, and could be effective. But okay, one last thing I'm going to say before we get on to looking at these is that one of my kind of hesitancies about no work culture is that I think I always have suspected that Marx in Capital and throughout his work, Karl Marx put such an emphasis on the value of work because work is the only economic kind of thing that the working class has. So his labor theory of value, aside from possibly being true, and that, you know, that means that he sees economic value as really deriving always from labor. Aside from possibly being true, I think he puts it, you know, at the center of his theory because he wants to give the working class something that they have, which they can use as a kind of bargaining chip. So, you know, I think if you get rid of work, then you kind of ruin Marx's theory, and then the working class don't really have anything. Now, I thought that was kind of, that all made sense to me, but I just found there's this quite new book, which is called Towards a New Manifesto by Horkheimer and Adorno, and it's recently been kind of published. It's just kind of been found and thrown together from some conversations they had as they were trying to conceive a new communist manifesto for their times. And in that, Adorno makes the very same point. So I was just kind of pleased that Adorno made the same point I've been thinking. So I don't feel completely alone there. But it's also a very good book and worth reading because it's quite candid. It's them, I think, recording their conversations, and it's actually quite funny, some of the things they say. But okay, that's my last theoretical point.
Yeah, I guess I have a one short point along those lines is I think for this movement, it is important to differentiate between work and labor, because I don't think the anti-work movement, for the most part, is anti-labor. They believe people have to do stuff, but work being you selling your labor power to someone else, this contracted employment, which is, the thing that they're trying to move away from. So not necessarily actually doing anything, because of course a lot of these stories that we'll probably read are people who have quit their job and now they're able to do something that they actually want to do. And that does come from obviously a privileged position most of the time, but the idea is more about against employment, against contracted labor that is alienating and exploitative. But I think you're right. Let's get on to looking at some memes.
Yeah, there is this, not really a meme, but we may as well start here as it's been up for a while. This person says pumpkin spice terrine. I guess it was a tweet. I'm not sure. It looks maybe like a tweet. Yeah. Says, yes, universal basic income would allow us to survive between jobs, but it would also allow us to grieve after loss, to move, to care for others, to have children, to create art, to start new businesses, etc., etc. Okay, so that's kind of a good point. Universal basic incomes have been experimented with. They were experimented with in Finland a couple of years ago, and actually they didn't go through with it. I think following pressure from the right, and actually really kind of agricultural adjacent right, a party that's traditionally kind of aligned with agriculture, so kind of rural people who kind of didn't like the idea of people just not working. I think that kind of collapsed it. But the experiment actually, I think, went okay. I think they gave 2,000 people universal basic income and said that it didn't stop them looking for jobs. So that's kind of good. Right. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea, but I just wonder, I think there's a big flaw in that everyone suddenly gets €1,000 a month, say, or $1,000. And wouldn't that just basically revalue everything? Wouldn't it just be, wouldn't that just become the baseline? So that people would then adjust prices. I mean, capitalists being what they are, and then it wouldn't really make any difference that we all got €1,000.
Yeah, I think any type of UBI like that would have to accompany some kind of strong regulation that would stop people from doing that, which I don't have the economic background to really understand how they would do that. But what I want to say about this is it highlights one of the reasons why people hate work so much, hate their employment, is, so this is a bit of a sensitive topic maybe, but I've had some mental health stuff and some tough things in my life recently, and when trying to talk to my job, I've been dismissed for it. And when I opened up and actually said told them some of the stuff I've been going through, and they were basically responded with, well, if this job isn't right for you, then maybe you need to look for another one, because, you have to be happy at work. You can't not be sad. So they're trying to take away that ability to grieve, to move on, to have some kind of human emotional response. And I can't actually afford to do that. Like many people can't afford to do that. They can't afford to take off a bunch of time and go through a grieving process or try to deal with maybe emotional or mental stuff that they have going on. So they're forced to continue this cycle of employment, which is very stressful and probably further those problems. So I think this tweet shows and is a good way of highlighting that, because people sometimes don't even think about, oh yeah, it would be nice to have these kind of options. And also it might be a highlight of one of the reasons why this subreddit can be so US focused is because, you know, obviously the European social democracies are not perfect by any means, but we lack in the US some of the stuff that Europe takes for granted, you know, like time off, like vacation days or sick days and stuff like that. Like, you know, there's companies that absolutely don't allow you to take vacations if they want, or they'll, if you have, at my work right now, we've had people whose vacations that were scheduled and approved for time off have been recently canceled, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, you can't have it anymore, we need you here. And you know, if they insist on taking their vacation, they're fired. You know, if they say, oh, I'm sick, I can't come in, they say, well, I'm sorry, if you don't come in, you are fired. So that kind of harshness creates this harsh hatred of the employment community.
Yeah, so I just moved on there whilst you were speaking, but it's also kind of relevant. It's another just tweet, and it says, funny how all the consumers and workers staying home brings the economy to its knees, and the job creators aren't keeping things running with their amazing bootstraps. Almost as if the people at the bottom, it's almost as if it's the people at the bottom who create wealth. Obviously, strongly supporting Marx's theory of labor value again. So I guess that's related to when we have lockdowns and people can't go to work, and that creates a huge problem. So yeah, it does show how much power we have, but you know, interesting that doesn't lead to a situation where we could then leverage our labor power better. Like, people aren't kind of getting together thinking, hey, look how much power we must have had to bring everything, you know, grinding to a halt. Why don't we have a general strike? That's not going to happen, because I think that you know, the powers that be are so effective at kind of atomizing us by now. And I think actually lockdown atomized us further, because then we all ended up on the internet, and that's great for atomizing people.
Yeah. And yeah, I was going to say the early days, we've talked about this before, the early days of those lockdowns, there was a lot of solidarity, it seemed like, but it very quickly fell away. And that is something that people need. I think that's why the left needs to be in these conversations, is because this great resignation and people becoming fed up and quitting, it in and of itself will lead to nothing. It has to have an organizational element to it. It has to have that foresight to say, hey, we should be sticking together. We should be working with each other. We should be thinking of what we want, not just, you know, walking off the job, which can feel great and everything. Of course, I love a good quit my job story, but you know, there's steps after that we have to have in order for it to be an effective political movement.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's definitely true. I mean, where should I go? Is this any good? Hang on. Okay, there you go.
I mean, that's a funny meme. It is funny, but I mean, it speaks to that thing. It's like that in and of itself won't do much. It'll make that person feel good temporarily.
Yeah, but it won't do much. When you wonder, like, I mean, obviously there's people coming to this forum with different kind of outlooks, and some seem kind of more kind of Marxist, and some just seem to be fed up with work. I don't know what the intention was behind it. Do you know who made the forum and why?
I don't know anything about the forum, really. Yeah, except that it's growing really strongly and people are really seeming to enjoy it. But that's about it.
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Does it really matter where somebody is kind of willing, so somebody's desire to not work comes from? I suppose the onus is then on the left to get those people to kind of put things together, put the pieces together, and see the problem as being capitalism. But I suppose that, you know, that maybe all begins with somebody just wanting to run off from their workplace.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that is because they're alienated. So, you know, I think in a way we need that kind of like movement, which I think is probably, it can be linked in with like the crystals movement, you know, kind of New Ageism of like, you know, work's so shitty, I just want to be with the trees kind of thing, which can dangerously push people right. But, you know, that's where the left needs to be able to kind of like identify, or not really identify people, but needs to be able to be there for people when they're sick of work and help them put the pieces together. But then it's not enough to say that, hey, do you not notice it's because of capitalism? That's not really where people are going to then jump on the left. It's more if you say we need to form a more community-based world. And actually, I think you have to offer, some vision of what that is, and maybe even, some community in kind of how would you say it, in a kind of seed form. It needs to be, I don't think it's enough to go, we need a communist utopia, obviously, and that's like fanciful. But surely, if you're actually showing people the community that you're proposing them, like there is somewhere they can go and hang out, you know what I mean? That's going to go a long way to pushing people towards the left, or I'd rather say into opening up the left for them. But I just don't really see much of that. I don't really see, I think we're so far from that on the academic and online left. We're not really offering anybody something which could draw them away from work in that way. And I think the right are doing it quite effectively.
That's true. I want to highlight this. There we are. Repression of grief in the workplace and lack of access to paid leave is a major component of our collective suffering. So that's obviously what we were talking about just a bit ago. But putting it that way actually highlights the connection we could draw with capitalist realism, where Fisher talks about politicizing mental health. I don't even know what I could add to that, because I think adding those two things together shows that connection. One of the ways to politicize mental health is to highlight the way that we produce society, how wage labor and commodity production is, and the way that workplaces are organized is actually one of the reasons why we have such strong mental health issues at the moment, without the ability to heal.
That's for sure, yeah. But I think pointing out that capitalism is responsible for causing mental health problems is very important, and that's really Fisher's main legacy. But I think he didn't see that as enough, clearly, and I think that's where Acid Communism comes in, his unfinished book.
Right.
When he talks about needing to form a counterculture, I think he's talking about needing to form a community, because I think actually, the idea that capitalism causes depression and that there's nothing we can do about capitalism is highly atomizing in itself. If you take those two facts together, and people often reduce capitalist realism, Fisher's first book, to capitalism causes depression and capitalism is insurmountable. So what is one supposed to do with that?
Yeah, there's a lot more to it, as we've discussed.
We have read the book and talked about it, but I think in terms of there being like another stage, that's where acid communism comes in. And I think we've been through this so many times, but he's not talking about just like we need more rave parties. He's saying we need like more places for people to hang out together.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, did you highlight that comment?
Yeah. I was just gonna throw up stuff if I see it come up, because I think that's just a good relation to what we were just saying. All right, let's see these self-made billionaires. How did the self-made billionaires get their start? Mom sat on the board as the CEO of IBM and convinced him to take a risk on her son's new company. That's Bill Gates. And then we got Jeff Bezos, who started Amazon with $300,000 in seed capital from his parents and more from some rich friends. Then we have down here Warren Buffett, who the son of a powerful congressman who owned an investment company. And then to the right of him, Elon Musk, whose dad owned an emerald mine in apartheid South Africa. I think that's a great meme, because it is both anti-work in some sense, but it's also just pointing out the capitalist lie of the self-made billionaire, of being able to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And why I think it fits into anti-work and generally is because I think a lot of this stuff is trying to highlight the fact that there's this overall mindset that's put on us that if you work really hard, then you can be one of these great people. You can make it, so to say. So by highlighting the fact that a lot of these people that we're told are self-made are not self-made, that they've got there through a system of exploitation that has benefited them long before, you know, they ever tried their business or whatever. This entrepreneurial spirit does not work out nearly as much as we're led to believe. So I think that's a good bridge between a general anti-work feeling and then bringing it into a more I mean, it is a critique of capitalism, but it's not of the actual system, but of like the functioning and the ideology that's perpetuated by capitalism. Yeah, real bootstrap stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is typical, yeah, and it's very damaging, and it's damaging, you know, on many different levels. I mean, there are the people who are kind of shown as kind of like a shining example of, you know, of how to achieve something, and they're often on the level of Elon Musk. But then I think if you, well, I know, just as you go through life, you meet people and they're like, you know, I saved all my pennies to buy my first house, and then you find out, you know, then they also had like a, you know, 30 grand windfall from their grandparents, or, you know, or whatever, which is great for them, you know. But I think it's very hard sometimes to deal with the ignorance of middle class people and upper class people as you go through life. And of course, it's not their fault. And that's when Michael Brooks says, what does he say again? Be good to people, be kind to people, ruthless with systems.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't want to be horrible about middle class people. A lot of my friends are middle class. Which sounds like a bizarre thing to say, you know.
Some of my best friends are middle class.
Yeah. Well, it's true. But you know, some of them really pissed me off when I was growing up, because it's just their ignorance. You know, the whole thing of like, you know, like, I don't have any money. Oh, why don't you go to the cash machine? You know, you get this kind of thing. You know, why don't we go to the bar? I don't have any money. Well, we can pass the cash machine on the way. It's like, no, I don't have any money in my bank. You know, you get this from people, and then they look at you like you're ill or something. I think it would be a lot easier if people understood more the situation of the working class. You know, generally.
Yeah.
And that's something, obviously, you know, why don't people understand the situation of, I would guess, the biggest class still? Why isn't that clear? Or why do you get politicians saying, you know, I could live on welfare benefits in the UK, I could live on that, fine, I could feed my kids, just eat porridge. You know, they don't get it. Or, you know, or I don't need to go to a food bank to get food. You know, if you're working and you're working on a minimum wage or whatever, of course you can afford food. Again, just eat porridge. It always comes out this porridge thing, and, you know, whatever. It's not that simple. If you're freelance, or if you're on a wage, like weekly wage, you often don't have enough money to plan ahead. So you're constantly, you know, you're buying the microwave meals or whatever. You're not buying like a massive bag of. They're always telling you, oh, you can buy 10 kilograms of porridge for it. I don't know how many rich people know. You know, why all these rich people know like how much porridge costs.
Yeah,
But anyway,
exactly. Well, there's memes now about, like, you know, billionaires trying to guess average things, and like Bill Gates saying something like, "Oh, I don't know, what is a carton of eggs, like $30?" And it shows how out of touch they are.
Yeah, but I suppose yeah. Go on.
But what I'm saying here is it's different when they're talking about MP salaries, and I think that goes for the U.S. too. Like, as much as people fight against like raising the minimum wage and stuff, Congress and stuff like that get cost of living adjustments all the time, and they're and they make much more than the average American or average worker. So I'm sure it's the same in most developed countries.
Okay, that's quite a kind of good point here, but I don't think there's much we can talk about except that, yeah, okay, capitalism is causing obviously huge problems, yeah, and if we factor in the environment, there are really strong motives now to change things, and again, we're not really allowed to know. We don't know about the lives of the working class or people in the global south. We're not supposed to really know that stuff, so people are they're aghast. People don't get why you can't afford to feed yourself, whatever. Even though that's a majority situation, a lot of us do have problems making ends meet and paying the bills, etc. We're not supposed to know about all that stuff. The media doesn't portray the lives of normal poor people, and it doesn't also push the idea that we need to end capitalism to save the world, basically. So where can we find an actual meme, which might be more fun? Okay, here we go.
If you keep them busy with basic needs, they will forget about the freedom they lost. I mean, this is kind of a boomer meme, but that's not an untrue point. I just think it needs a little bit of amending, and I would amend it with Marcuse, with Essay on Liberation. He talks a good bit about the needs that we think we have. What become basic needs are updated all the time due to the demands of capitalism. Obviously a cell phone is not a basic need in the sense of 1950s. But today, it kind of is a basic need for many people, But you'll have conservatives say shit like, oh, well, how can they be poor? They have a cell phone. And you even saw this in the 90s with how can they be poor? They have refrigerators, not understanding the way that needs evolve and stuff like that. But we could even take this into the way that everyday stuff is commodified under capitalism, housing, healthcare, all this kind of stuff, schooling. It's commodified to the point where you have to work quite a bit. It creates, a consumer worker kind of mix where you have to do both of those in order to even reproduce yourself, right? So it is kind of sickening when you think about it that way.
Yep. Sorry, I'm just trying to find.
Yeah. Keep scrolling. Keep scrolling. Let's see what this Starbucks guy has. I'm curious about that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Starbucks.
Just because it's Starbucks. It's capitalism
Starbucks
with a human
feels
face.
somehow important in this conversation. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Caleb has a degree in zoology and asks his customers what their favorite animal is. He gives them facts while completing their orders. So that's interesting because it's a cross post from the Happy subreddit. So this is something I think that also speaks to the rise of the anti-work kind of movement, is all of these articles that are meant to put this human face on capitalism. That we'll talk about this. So this is Happy because it's like, oh, that's cool. And honestly, as a coffee shop worker myself, part-time, and as a coffee shop connoisseur, I do think that would be kind of cool. But there's a deeper problem there.
It's like, this is Adam. Adam reads regularly philosophy to large audiences. He works in a coffee shop, and every time they order a coffee, he tells them about capitalism.
This is true. No, that's true. That's true. But there is something, disturbing about it when you think about it.
If it was Starbucks, that would be amazing.
It would, but it's not. It's not Starbucks. Okay, that's cool. We can keep going. But yeah, it makes me think of those people who, it's like those articles where it's like, this kid sold lemonade to afford their mother's cancer treatment. And, and it's presented as a heartwarming story as if it's not pure dystopia, Phil.
Okay. So this is just saying that this anti-work has become huge. How many people did it have on it now? Was it a million? 1.1 million.
Yeah.
And it says, what is this? So where it says like 1.1 million idlers, 33,000 not working. Is that literally a stat of how many of them?
That I don't know. I don't know. I don't understand Reddit. I am a bit of a.
Oh, hang on. I think that normally that's like how many are in the group, how many are online, isn't that?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's 1.1 million. That's a lot, yeah. Well, I suppose this is all pretty much leftist, but it wouldn't have to be. I mean, a lot of people, obviously, into not working, who are probably into QAnon as well and stuff. So
yeah, I think it's leftist in the broad sense, but some of that can be quite how do you say it? Reactionary. It has some Luddite stuff in it, which I have nothing against the actual Luddites, but the broader anarcho-primitivist movement, I am not for. And I think there is some of that in there, this whole thing of like any kind of machine bad. But
Yeah, I think it's a theme that appeals to many people. Though I think there could be people in this group who then just end up voting Republican or whatever. You know, this might be fun to look at work, but I'm not sure we have 1.1 million, you know, Bernie supporters here, or you know, whatever.
True.
And would that even really make a big difference? But anyway, so this is like it's kind of a boomery looking meme about boomers. Like it's been made by a boomer and it's anti-boomer. But it's this old chestnut of your parents had it really easy and then you have it really hard, which is of course true to some large degree. I guess my parents must have bought a house for like much less than I would have to pay for a house, and I certainly can't afford one.
Oh yeah.
They did have mortgages and stuff. They struggled, but yeah, they had houses and stuff.
Yeah. And so this is really just showing, I think memes like this are just trying to highlight the fact that, I mean, it's almost nostalgic in a way. It's a nostalgia for the actually functioning social democracy type days, or like a post New Deal in the left, where it's like this brief window where things seem to actually work if you were, you know, white and mostly male. But I mean, and it's good because it shows that today isn't failing. You know, the youth of today aren't necessarily failing to live up to these standards, but that the standards are unrealistic. But it is also, nostalgic for a point which, sure, it might be a little bit better in some respects than what we have now, but it's not something to actively fight for. You know, it's not socialism by any means. It's not a better world. It's just a slightly more humane machine gun.
You mean in the past?
Yeah.
I mean, it was, well, yeah, I mean, because by the early 80s, it was obviously Reagan was in power in America and Thatcher in the UK. So they weren't where they are now by any means, but they would have been if they could have been. You know, I mean, I think it's hard to imagine that Thatcher and Reagan would have at some point stopped us getting to where we are now. You know, if they could be in power now or something, you know, if you can imagine that. It's hard to think that they would have gone, you know, that's going too far. I think they may have put the brakes on at the time, you know, in the sense that if things have been going, you know, where they are now, they were so conservative, like, you know, in the kind of real sense, that they might have been like, that's too far, but only because it would have been too quick. You know, I don't think that's to say that they would have objected to things, you know, getting where they are now over time. But anyway, yeah, it's not, the things weren't like really better then. It's just that, you know, neoliberalism has not existed as long as it now has, basically.
Right.
And you know, of course, things back then were kind of boring in a way. I mean, I was like 1 year old in 1980, but I mean, I remember like the late 80s and 90s. And again, of course, I was young, so you know, how exciting could things have been? You know, apart from playing with my toys and whatever. But still, I was in my late teens in the late 90s, and there wasn't much to do. You know, there wasn't much stimulus compared to today. I mean, I'm not saying things are better today by any means, but
all right, yeah. What's this? Okay, capitalism, how it is. Damn, a robot took my job. Now I have to look for a new source of monetary income. Socialism, how it should be. Yay, a robot took over my job. Now I am free to actually enjoy life. I think this is a little silly because it kind of somewhat, I know this is not the intention, implies that it's like under socialism, you have to wait for your industry to be automated. And until then, you have to keep working, you know, in the same type of labor exploitation. But it is the highlight there. I think that, you know, you, Mike, are rightfully scared of that automation will just bring a new form of corporate feudalism, etc. And I think that is a absolutely worthwhile fear. I just also find socialist automation to be a promising thing. So maybe if you want to talk about that a little bit more, we could do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think socialist automation would require that we had socialism before we had automation, before we get to such a degree of automation that it means no working. I mean, that's the issue. I mean, from what I understood of Cernacek and Williams' book, I'm sorry that I forget the name of it, but the book on kind of accelerations and no working book. From what I understand, they were quite against traditional protest and socialist type movements, which they called folk politics, and they were pushing for a politics which engaged technology more, and in which our demands were less of like, fundamentally reforming for example, the welfare system, and more of demanding that technology kind of puts us in certain positions, and from that would follow, a revised kind of social and welfare system, if I get that right. And I just don't entirely go along with that. I think that we need like a ground movement of people, just kind of bog standard politics, people going on the streets and talking with other people. I think that has to precede. Any notion of automation bringing about communism or socialism. It's just not going to happen otherwise. I just think that you're going to have a very wealthy class just abuse the world. And if you put this together with, abuse the world, because it's going to become their playground. Basically, they can do what they want if people don't. If they don't need people to be working for them, they can kind of basically treat those people as irrelevant. And if you combine that with the metaverse, frighteningly, if we have like a situation where we can all go and like look at mountainscapes on our computers, that leaves a position where we could potentially live in very small spaces and quite quickly have our desires manipulated such that we only needed like certain kind of Muzak style landscapes beamed at us, and the ruling elite could have like, how would you call it? Have the freedom of the world. They could do what they wanted with the world itself. So yeah, I'm not that hopeful about any of this. I think that technology is not going to deliver us. I think we just need people getting together and understanding what's happening and forming a movement to make socialism happen. So I mean, it's kind of primitivist, but I mean, it sounds kind of like I'm a Luddite, but I still think there's no replacement. I think we can use tech to get people mobilized, but tech in itself isn't going to be the solution.
Right. I don't think tech in and of itself is the solution, but I don't think we should be afraid of it either. Only in the sense of the way that it could be used. I think technology in this sense is liberating, or has the potential to liberate. But it is how it's used. Of course, it's the logic of production that it's forced to do. The tech in and of itself, yeah, it doesn't matter. I think it's good to eliminate hard labor, and honestly, any kind of unwanted labor, as much as we can. But I do think you're right that, of course, unless that's so here it is for me. I think it's not before or after, but it needs to be an accompaniment. That those things have to happen at the same time as the world is automating, because it already is. To do a post-automation movement, or a post-technological growth movement, I don't think is the way to go. I think it's to direct how that automation and technology is to move forward. So I think the way Marcuse talked about it in Essay on Liberation was that, that there is this revolution that happens and the concrete demands are born out of it. And he's speaking, of course, from like the student and Black liberation and LGBTQ rights. But I think you could also apply that to the broader technology revolution that is happening to us. it's not one we're leading, but we need to have a voice within it and kind of demand that it be used in a way that doesn't just fuck us over more, that is at the benefit of people at large rather than at the benefit of a small minority, the uber rich, which of course that's what the uber rich want it to be used for. But I do think that, yeah, it could be quite powerful to use it against them, to use it against class society in and of itself. But yeah, that is the issue. Let's see what's going on.
Yeah, I don't know what this one's even talking about. Yeah, they're not like very proficient at memeing in this group, but I guess, yeah, it's a very popular group anyhow, so that says something. Actually, I do find the memes here, like, they're not very advanced as memes in terms of what we think of as memes, but they're not very sarcastic either. They're kind of quite nice in a way. They're just kind of like, people kind of communicating with each other their disdain for capitalism and work without being deeply sarcastic. So it's quite different from, like, Politigram and a lot of Facebook groups.
Yeah. That's a really good point, actually. It is way different than the memes that we're used to, that we're steeped in all the time. I want to address Ofo Omni. Technology and its relationship to climate collapse is something to consider. And I think you're referring to my somewhat techno-optimism there, although it is reserved. And you're right, that is something to consider. I think that properly applied, technology and automation and artificial intelligence, and the key there is properly applied, does have the potential to limit that kind of damage and to really take it into account. That's something that today we don't take into account. As all this stuff is happening, the climate collapse and the environment at large is not considered within the equation. And I think any type of socialist society in the future would have to, and I mean, honestly, we have to now, but would have to take that into consideration. So I think of something like in Chile, the project Cybersyn, and, the way that it incorporated these cybernetic feedback loops and stuff. If we were to try something like that again, which I am in favor of, I think the environment and ecology itself is something that would have to absolutely take precedent in any sort of calculation like that. I think we have to have an integrated view of the world beyond mere human species and obviously beyond one kind of nation. So it has to be international, and I think it has to be interspecies, any type of movement forward. I mean, I know that's a huge ask, of course, but I do think that's the type of idealism we need.
It's such a task ahead. I mean, we can't even get Bernie as, like, the candidate for the Democrats. Not that he would be the next, he wouldn't be running, I wouldn't think, next time. We can't even get Corbyn in power. I mean, we're just so far. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know. Anyway, that's like a massive other subject. I'm just having a kind of having a panic there.
Yeah, that's a rightful comeback, honestly.
I mean, but we just, right. I just don't see how we're going to make anything happen unless we, again, get onto the streets. But I don't mean getting on the streets like a million of us on the streets. I don't really mean on the streets even. I just mean like going and talking to people. We need people who can go and talk to people and say, yeah, okay, your job sucks. Why do you think that is? You get conversations happening and people feel community happening. And it has to be that way around. But I already said this earlier, but probably a few people have joined us since then. But I just don't see how we can prove the value of communism, i.e. leading to community and, a society led by community and sharing, not by making money, if we don't show the community bit already. And we're not showing the community bit. And actually, I think a lot of right-wing populists, they get into like the right wing because, you look at QAnon, for example, but also I think some right-wing political parties in Finland, where I live, like the True Finns party, and the Republicans, I guess, that they offer this kind of like getting together and cooking sausages, you know, or whatever else, or like it could be like a whole pig or whatever you do in America. But you know, I mean, the barbecue or whatever, or whatever it is, you know, getting together with the guys, the girls, and you know, it's a community. It's replacing maybe the church or something, or it links in with the church for them. I don't know what we offer that's like that. We're not really getting to the people. We're all like, you know, revolutions and like rave parties and stuff within the acid left and the online left. And it's just not what's going to infuse the public. We need to be able to really empathize with the public, their needs. A lot of people are worrying about putting, you know, their kid through school or whatever, and then on to uni or whatever they do, or, you know, looking after the grandma. I mean, you know, we have to reach people on these levels, which needs, you know, it needs a big movement. And sorry, I'm kind of really diverging here, but yeah, exactly. There's a comment here by why we are in the left, many of us, because we are already alienated and atomized. Exactly. But how do we all find each other now? How do we make things happen? In terms of any viable no worker movement, if we were to go down the no work route, I see a lot of people prepared just to give up working because, you know, the lockdown taught them that they can survive without work. Many of them who went out of work, and they don't want to go back to their dead end jobs. You know, but we need to then get those people together. You know, and I think there's going to be more of that with a lot of welfare systems being shored up across the West. But then, how do we politicize these people? Okay, that's a good story.
Yeah, McDonald's workers in Denmark won good pay and benefits through striking. That is a great story. And it shows, I think, other countries in the world that, hey, wait a second, McDonald's could pay these people more. It's absolutely not a problem for them. It's like, you know, Walmart, I think it's the biggest employer in the U.S. still. They could pay people, what was it? I think it was like $100 an hour and barely scratch their major profits, right? So it's like, that's not the issue that these companies face. I also want to say that for anyone following it, for the John Deere workers, that they finally signed a contract, their union signed a contract, and they got all the things that they wanted, from my understanding. I just saw it this morning, so I have to read more in depth about it, but they got rid of the tier system that they were striking against, which promised newer employees less benefits, which is something that the union did not want, which is really nice to see them not only try to secure their benefits, but try to secure everyone's benefits. Yeah, so strikes do work if they can happen. It's in a lot of situations, and I know it's in the U.S. unions are very low and very fought against, but you know, they're worth supporting, and I think most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, companies will always drive wages down. It's complex. Hang on, what's happening now?
That meme, yeah, this one. Go up a little bit.
Okay.
All employees must stop crying before returning to work. I mean, so simple and so funny, I think. And I think it would be good practice to print these out and go into, you know, public locations and put them in their bathrooms, because that might click in someone's head a little bit. Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, we of course don't recommend or condone this, but it's quite a wonderful story. Florida man stole Walmart clothes and secretly worked as a cashier. He kept all the cash and he made $2,000 in 4 hours. People do that, you know, fairly often in the U.S., more than you would expect. It's amazing what a uniform can do. It can make you seem legitimate, and people will trust you when you have a uniform.
It's like Squid Game, where the guy kind of steals a uniform from the guards. And the thing there is that you notice that no one can really work it out because they don't really know each other, because there isn't really a sense of community there. They are kind of atomized. And it's a bit like that in supermarkets. I remember working in Homebase when I was like in my late teens. It's like a supermarket, but for like hardware stuff, like plants and like flowers and lawnmowers and shit, compost. And this guy I knew didn't work there, but got a home base like jacket. Like they had this green kind of jacket with a home base logo. It's like having a Walmart jacket. I guess they have jackets and stuff with a logo. And he found one in a charity shop, and he just thought it was cool. It was funny to wear it. So he used to go and wear it to nightclubs and stuff. It was just like this cheesy thing he did. I guess there's probably people going around wearing Walmart stuff to nightclubs and stuff, or bars for a joke. And anyway, he went into a home base, and first people were like, the supervisors were like, why is that guy not working? Who is he? Is he one of us? Why is he just walking around? What's he doing? They couldn't work out that he wasn't one of them, which is the most worrying thing about it, And they told him you can't wear that. Eventually, they made him like surrender his home base coat because he wasn't allowed, because he was like impersonating a home base worker.
Right. They didn't want it.
But yeah, the thing is, they don't know who their staff are often, which says something in itself.
Yeah, Stephen K says that he was working at a site building, and the superintendent told the day shift and night shift not to talk to each other. And I think that happens quite a bit, actually. People are discouraged on certain jobs from communicating with each other because they don't want, the higher ups don't want the employees to have a sense of community, a real sense, and they don't want them to know maybe the differences in what's going on. So he got 100 union made stickers of his exact words and made them, and he was surrounded by his BS on 100 hard hats that he had to see every day. That's great. That's hardcore. I hope it worked out well for you. He got knocked back down to his tools with us and claimed that situation down quick. Oof. My resume is basically a list of things I hate to do. Now, this is a true old school boomer meme. I kind of love it. Yeah, wow. Yeah, now
What's this saying?
Step 1, evict all the poor people. Step 2, incarcerate them for being homeless. And step 3, profit off their forced labor. This is because in the U.S. we have prison systems which have job requirements, many of them, and those people do not get paid, or they get paid very, very little, and they do mass amounts of work in the U.S. They pick garlic for Whole Foods. They make license plates, all sorts of stuff. As YY says here, it's a reserve army of labor, which, I think that fits into it as well. It's slavery, really. I mean, I think it's hard to not think of it like that. So especially
it's a pretty perverse situation that is seen as perverse by everybody outside the US. There's a few things like that about the US, actually. But I mean, it's a weird thing of it being the most powerful country in the world. It's a bit like the UK being very powerful and having had a huge empire, and of course being the most powerful country before the US was. But its actual own working class being, living in total shit conditions. You'd think like, the most powerful country in the world would have, an elite working class in comparison to other countries, but they're like amongst the most shat upon working classes in the world. And then you think about it, it's not that weird that in the belly of the beast things would be pretty bad, because if those people are prepared to go and like fuck over people all over the world, of course they're going to mistreat their own people. And I think there's also, I don't know how many British people but I mean, there is a certain kind of like, maybe it's a bit like America, there's a certain downtrodden quality to the British, and they're also that they're a little bit like, they say sorry too much. If you ever like been in London or the UK and you bump into somebody and they're like, like sorry, really like pleadingly sorry. And I think it's a bit because they are used to being scared of their own ruling elite. There's a certain amount of, I think the Americans as well, being terrified of an elite that so easily and willfully suppresses people all over the world. That does have an impact, I think, psychologically on a movement back home, that people are aware that my ruling elite is responsible for screwing over the whole world. That does probably keep people back. I mean, the symbolic is very strong in that sense. I don't think people are unaware or aren't subconsciously affected by the power of their own government in America and the UK.
Here's Richard Wolff saying there is no labor shortage. There is a shortage of good jobs, good pay, good job conditions. When workers refuse bad jobs, bad pay, and poor job conditions, employers whine labor shortage. Don't be fooled. I think that's mostly true. That's what these people are quitting for, and that's why they're not taking jobs. There's also, a large portion of the U.S. people that have not returned to work are women with children, because they have no way of taking care of their children without it. They don't have access to affordable childcare, so they've opted to just not return. So that's another condition there. And
yeah,
I think there's also a lie being spread by corporations. There's been kind of some investigative journalism done around this recently, where these people are saying, "Oh, we can't hire anyone. No one's applying, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." But then it comes out that they're putting out saying, "Oh yeah, we're hiring for $20 an hour." But then when people apply, they're saying, "Okay, well, actually, we're going to give you $11 an hour, and and you'll have the opportunity to get a raise later on." And people are saying, "Well, no," because they feel like they're being lied to, and $11 an hour is not enough to live on. But then also, people are just not getting called back. There was a story about a guy in Florida where I live that I think he applied to like 60 jobs and only got one callback or interview or something like that, even though these companies are claiming they're so desperate for labor. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them being when you have a labor shortage, or when a company doesn't have enough laborers to fill the positions, they just get the other people to work harder. That's what's happening at the supermarket I'm with now. We are severely understaffed, and everyone's working like crazy, and it's driving us all mad. It's, about to be Thanksgiving and Christmas, and those are like retail hell. People know this, and being so understaffed, it's even harder. There's so much to do, and it creates more dangerous conditions, and obviously affects the mental situation of the workers. So it's not like the companies are only hurting; they benefit a little bit from it too.
Yeah, I just want to move into what we're doing on Monday a little bit. So, I mean, just it's making me think where Richard Wolff is saying that people might just turn down jobs because the jobs aren't good enough. That's something that can happen in certain countries, but not something that can happen everywhere. And in some countries, people just want a job, or in fact, also in the UK and the US, etc. A lot of people just do want a job. But if we're getting in a position where more and more people can turn down those jobs, especially maybe having lived without working during lockdown and realizing they don't need to go back to their shitty jobs for whatever reasons, perhaps the welfare situation has marginally improved and they feel they can live off of welfare, or I don't know. But if that situation continues and we actually do get a position where we can have a universal basic income, we're basically going to have a class of consumers in the West who are buying products from, for example, China. And that's all good and well for a while. But doesn't that mean eventually China are going to start calling the shots? We can't really have that situation indefinitely and not expect China to start to have more influence socially and culturally. If they're producing everything and our only role is, as a kind of consumer class, I think they're not going to want to stop there. I think that, anyway, I think, we're heading to a position where eventually China will start to leverage more control over our attitudes in some kind of way. And I only really say that because I think that, I think that's true, but also I wanted to say it because it leads into a little bit of what we're doing next. because we're having on Monday Conrad Hamilton come on and talk to us in this kind of live format again. And Conrad wrote a manifesto called Manifesto for Post-Pandemic Politics, which he wrote with Aelita Collective, which I think is a collective linked to Aelita Books, bookshop in London, where Danny Badman Massive works. Danny, who used to do a lot of the video editing and work with Doug Lane when he was with Zero Books. Anyway, Conrad's coming on, and Conrad is a big kind of, I won't say he's pro-China, but he does seem to certainly think China holds a lot of the balance of power, and something about China is important in terms of whether we're going to achieve communism or not, etc. So yeah, I think a little bit at the end he alludes to the power of China at the end of that manifesto, but overall the manifesto, I think more is about how the pandemic proved the kind of ineffectiveness of capitalism and the inequality that capitalism causes. I mean, that became very apparent to people through the pandemic and the lockdown. And then you have the situation where the government stepped in with increased welfare, and the state basically had to assure certain things to combat COVID. And it leaves us thinking, well, okay, well, if the state can do that, why can't the state do other things? Why can't it prolong its kind of universal basic income in the States effectively, when it gave everyone money for a while, or a couple of payments? So he talks about that a lot. So it's a really interesting manifesto that raised a lot of issues, also about the ineffectiveness of parliamentarism. How the fuck do you say this? Of parliamentary politics and electoral politics generally, and how Bernie and Corbyn were onto a good thing in many ways, but they were too convinced by the kind of negotiation route that we take through electoral politics, and Conrad was pointing out how that's not entirely effective. So that's very interesting, because it raises the issues of like, well, what else can we do? So we're gonna have Conrad here and ask him if he has a plan. Not that anyone has much of a plan, but we'll see what he comes up with. So that will be on Monday. We talk to Conrad. So someone's saying something here, celebrity author. Do you not agree with Yanis Varoufakis that capitalism is dead and has been replaced by something entirely different, techno-feudalism? In a sense, I do agree, but it's techno-feudalism. I think that's where I didn't quite get where he's getting at. But I didn't read the entire article that I think was in a major publication recently. Because feudalism, wasn't entirely worse than capitalism. So to say that we're going ahead to something worse and then calling it feudalism, I'm not sure about. And I only say that because I finished reading the first part of Das Kapital, Marx's Capital, recently, and you learn through that how feudalism was kind of abolished because there was more money in sheep grazing in the UK. So basically the lords started turning over their land to sheep, which meant they wanted to clear them of housing, and people who had otherwise lived on their land and farmed and given some of their produce to the lords in return, or money to the lords. So yeah, basically they trashed the commons. So when you say things are getting worse, they're going towards techno-feudalism, I don't know if I totally agree with the term, but I think things are getting worse. They're getting to a more awful form of capitalism, maybe. But if someone can explain why it would be specifically a techno-feudalism, then maybe I will understand better.
Yeah, I haven't read the Varoufakis yet about capitalism being dead and techno-feudalism. I know he wrote something about it and had a conversation with Zizek. I just haven't had the time to get to it. I think I agree that it is a change, that it is heading that way, like I highlighted there. But I'm not sure we're there yet. I think capitalism has this tendency to mutate and change as it is. I mean, that's long been in this like post-Marxist, Western Marxist theory that we're always talking about. The reason I think that it's being called techno-feudalism is that it is the renting. It's this way. It's this return to rent being an effective thing. So wait, let's see what YY says here is good. It's effectively feudalism in its relation between capitalists, but mediated through liberal relationships of productions at lower levels. Here. It seems that with corporations having a bigger GDP than many nations, it does seem to be heading towards that kind of feudalism.
I suppose what's being suggested is that we're allowed to live on the. It's going back to kind of being allowed to live on the land.
Right. Allowed to use the commons.
We're being kind of tolerated and being, and I think I could see how it would work in terms of digital capitalism, and we're kind of like we're living within a digital realm a lot of the time. I mean, basically all the time, even when we're not online, I think, and we kind of like inhabit it. We don't really profit much off it, but we do produce all the time for the overlords, i.e., like Facebook, etc., through data. So. Okay, I'm starting to see why it might be termed a feudalism.
Yeah, and I think that rentness, the return to the prominence of rent is really important for these types of theories. I want to say about the fact that these nations have bigger, or the corporations, some of them have bigger GDPs, gross domestic products, than many nations, is also. It reminds me of something I heard C. Derek Varn say a long time ago. I think it was on an old Pop the Left episode, or Diet Soap's Pop the Left, before Doug Lane and Derek were with Zero Books. And it was about how, today you could kind of look at corporations as a form of dual power, like the Leninist dual power. And that's scary because it's true. And if that is the case, if they're operating with their own systems, they could go into this feudalist type of thing. And I think we're seeing that with Amazon has proposed company towns recently, like making a whole Amazon city or township or whatever. And in America, I'm not sure the rest of the world, but I know in America, we have a history of company towns with like coal towns and, other mining towns. And it's not good by any means. So I think it's fair to argue that we could be heading to a neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism, but I don't think it's actually fair to say we're already in one.
Well, I think in that sense we need to look at what aspects of feudalism were not completely nefarious or negative, and maybe think. Excuse me. I was kind of getting tongue-tied there. And maybe think how we could have a commons, in our own time, for example.
Yeah. Stephen K says it's more open now and tolerated than it would have been previously. Remember how much hell Walmart was catching through like South Park and the death of small business. Now it's just a given. That is kind of true. That is true. I don't know. I think it depends on where you are. So I think that's in a U.S. situation. I think it depends where you are in the U.S. I know there are many rejections of Walmart and bigger corporations as well that embrace like a localism type thing. But that localism, as much as it kind of feels good, does also rely heavily upon tech giants like Amazon. It's not as local as it may appear.
I think we're going to see many different things happen. I think if you have a system like capitalism, which is so kind of like prevalent, if it gives way to something else, it's not going to be as simple as it just simply gives way to something else. I think there's going to be a period of like things being proposed and possibilities coming into play. So I think we need to kind of be aware of that and look out for ways in which we can kind of hijack whatever is developing and make that good. And of course, I think it's worth bearing in mind something that Frederick Jameson said in, I think, the book Late Marxism. He said that Marx basically, and actually it's something that Marx anyhow says, but I like the way Jameson put it, that Marx basically saw capitalism as the best and worst thing that ever happened to humanity. And I think, and I've said this before, I think actually I said it in my recent book, that if that's the case, then the internet is also, possibly more so, the best and worst thing that ever happened to humanity. So I think, also with NFTs coming up and crypto and whatever potential there is there, we're going to see a lot of things that converge that are all very good and very bad. And it depends how we appropriate them and manage to turn them to our own ends. So I think really, there's more at play than ever before. And if we're talking about capitalism's giving way to something else, then, if you look at that term, which is attributed to Jameson again and Zizek and Fisher, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. If we're now talking about something else maybe coming into play, that perhaps isn't the worst thing. That isn't the worst possible thing. It's just, how do we leverage something good within that new thing?
Right. Well, I know we're probably going to be getting off real soon, but since it kind of brought up a little bit here, I want to go back to the case for automation a little bit, and think of that book, which the People's Republic of Walmart, and that's based on a Jameson essay, and in it argues basically for the nationalization and maybe eventually socialization of a company like Walmart, which is, I'm pretty sure, still the largest employer in the U.S. And the reason being is that if you look at those things, Walmart, and then you could also take Amazon into this, but they are much more than just the stores. There's also a whole logistics network there that is really important to actually think about. And those logistics networks operate on some kind of cybernetic level. There's almost as many logistics centers as there are distribution centers for Walmart. And we don't think about those as being a component. We don't think about the shipping that goes along to it. And to be able to actually take that system and make it work for something better rather than the accumulation of private wealth, you could do a lot with that. But that's a hard one. But it's an interesting way to go about it.
I like this. Revolutions are basically not a feature of liberal states. Techno-feudalism may open a door to more agitation if it can't effectively legitimize itself. But we've seen this kind of as a policy, I think, in places like Syria and Libya and Iraq, the kind of total hollowing out of the country in terms of any leadership, even though, there is, Assad is still there. A kind of an anarchy that presumably just leaves the oil fields open to be controlled, perhaps more easily without any kind of governance or obligation to kind of notions of democracy. I mean, that's one thought I have, that this is something that's kind of being used to capitalism's advantage, or at least to the advantage of people who are making profit. But also on a more positive light, that Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World both had like a class of people outside the network of work who seemed to be kind of more free than the people tied into society, so to speak. And I just wonder, if you go down this route of agitation, as YY describes it, of the possibility of there being kind of like countercultural movements, but also kind of mini states between the metropolises. I'm also thinking there about new forms of transport and the fact of more and more home working, and metropolises therefore becoming somehow more important, and that leaving kind of whole areas where people can kind of live alternative lifestyles. So I just wonder if that may be a feature, that there may be kind of alternative communities that grow up between like megapolises. But anyway, that's just a thought that came to mind there.
Yeah. We'll just have to make sure, that like Amazon doesn't get their own private militias to stamp those things out first.
Well, yeah, that's also obviously that's a factor. But you wonder why in 1984 there does exist that, because obviously Orwell thought quite clearly through that. It remains kind of a blueprint, but it remains like the colloquial term for like totalitarianism, like 1984. And I wonder if it's like a safety valve for the capitalist or post-capitalist system, that you have these communities of people who can go and take drugs and find prostitutes and get involved in acid communist raves or whatever, that will be necessary kind of reality. Because I think there are precedents, in society anyway, that on the edge of financial districts, you often find an area which is like a little bit loose in terms of like how late you can drink alcohol, how easy you can get drugs and whatnot. Not that I'm saying that's entirely a good thing, but you do have these kind of safety valves. So I wonder if that will be a factor.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It can. It's also the way, again, to bring it back to Essay on Liberation by Marcuse. I think it's just so fresh in my head since we recently read it. Is this way he talks about it, about the sexual revolution that happened, and obviously he was pro sexual revolution and getting rid of these taboos that society, especially American society, was so strict about and so repressive. But he says, these energies have to move from libidinal to political. They can't stay in the libidinal, because then what happens is capitalism loosens those repressions and then incorporates them, and then it acts, like you were saying, Mike, as a pressure valve, and it makes things just a little bit better. So while these things pop up, you can't wait too long. Once they're incorporated into the system, even if they may be good for like individuals and for groups of people, they no longer pose a threat to the system itself. It's when they're in that rebellious libidinal phase that they have to move to a more politicized state.
I agree there, but I suppose that Marcuse said, he seemed to kind of place a lot of importance on the class of people who weren't really part of the economy, who weren't getting like their false desires satisfied, so they weren't having like their desires remanufactured by capitalism and then having those desires satisfied through commodities and whatever. So he said those people that might be most kind of interested in having some kind of revolution. So his kind of great refusal, I think he saw like students, immigrants, and unemployed people coming together. So he does kind of suggest that maybe it's in those pockets of people that are allowed to kind of deviate from social norms that you might find some kind of revolution take place. But of course, what you say is right, that it will highly likely be stamped out or redirected, and it was.
Yeah. The way you had like
Marcuse was talking in the late 60s and 70s. We know that didn't really work. So yeah, I don't know. I think still maybe that's where there's some hope, but you need to grow things up more effectively. I think when you make a movement which is highly antagonistic towards authority, of course it's going to be stamped out quite quickly, and today you'd think exceedingly quickly, because right now we're talking like on the internet against the system, so we're not like, it's not like we may as well put targets on our heads. I think the question is, how would you grow up something without it being immediately antagonistic to the system? And I think that's where you have to be really, really subtle. And it'd be more about just getting people to think, well, your life's not really working. How could it work better? And people going, oh yeah, what if we led a more community-based lifestyle? But that being like totally like, you basically you embed the whole thing in old grannies having tea parties, and then it's a Trojan horse. It doesn't seem dangerous, and then suddenly you have like a whole world that cares about each other. I don't literally mean old grannies having tea parties, but you have a non-threatening kind of caring movement. And it doesn't get stamped out. I mean, people have church parties all the time, church fetes, bringing buy sales at the church, whatever you would call them, car boot sales, and the government doesn't come down and stamp them out. It's possible to convene and not be an immediate threat and get stamped out. It's like, how does one convene? The thing is, if once that becomes big, though, people caring about each other on a big level and not caring so much about commodities, it would be stamped out as a threat somehow. It would be presented as a threat. It's really hard to think a way out of that, frankly. All I can say is that people need to get together and talk more.
Yeah. It has to be social. It has to be social.
Yeah,
that's why.
Says government did stamp out raves, though, but that's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah. Government stamped out raves, but of course raves were a bit of people getting together and loving each other, especially when they were high on ecstasy. But that's something that's never going to work. That community is never going to like have much of a political impact, because I think partly I'm not like making a conservative judgment here. It's just how I see people thinking. It's not family oriented, so it scares people. The love it, in rave culture is not family oriented, so people panic when they see that kind of thing.
I have to say something though. The government, and I know I'm pretty sure that's referring to the UK. Government did stamp out raves, and happened in the US too, but they didn't just stamp them out. What they did was incorporate them back into the system, whereas now raves are big fucking festivals that are hyper capitalist machines, right? They're and it's removed a lot of the ethos but kept the aesthetic, and that's a lot of the danger. So just like we were talking about, or just a little bit ago, about like queer liberation and stuff like that, in the 60s, 70s, maybe even into the 80s, that had very radical potential, and it still is great because people should be able to express themselves and live their lives and have their desires, not against queer liberation, but now it has been incorporated back into the thing where you have like, rainbow capitalism, that's a thing. So just like was raves that had this like kind of radical core to them, even if they weren't outright political or going to actually lead to a revolution, they were stamped out officially and then incorporated back, and you have stuff where it's like these giant EDM festivals where you can buy tons of stuff, and it's in these giant fields. It's taken away the magic from them, and they're hella fucking popular, and it's pretty sad to see, honestly, when you think about that. And I didn't live through the era where raves were actually, or I wasn't old enough to experience them in that way, but looking back on it, I do see the lost future of it. And yeah, drugs, that's true too.
Yeah, I went to like some raves at the tail end of that culture in the 90s, and some kind of anarchist raves in the early 2000s. And you didn't get any feeling of it being politically effective. I mean, these were raves often organized by like the anarchist contingent in London, and I mean there was a sizable anarchist movement, but it just didn't feel like they had any program. That's the thing with drug culture. It's very hard to like take the feelings people have on drugs and transpose them onto like an actual movement. I suppose partly because psychedelic experience doesn't really lend itself to political movements and power structures in that way. So that's very tricky. Not to be anti-drugs at all, but just because YY said something again in chat there.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that certainly that's part of the experience, the whole drug thing, and also, extrapolating from that kind of some kind of spiritual experience. That's certainly something. But I don't think it's ever really been convincingly kind of appended to worker politics or to socialist politics. And that's sad. I mean, and that's part of, I think, the reason why things failed in '68 and also in America in the late '60s. You had like this vibrant hippie culture, but it wasn't really kind of like clicking with union politics and stuff.
Well, and union politics wasn't clicking with them. That's something they say in Essay on Liberation. He brings up, it's like the interestingness of in like the capitalist countries, the organized labor was strongly against the countercultural movements, but in the emergent fascist countries, the organized labor and left movements embraced those countercultural movements and helped, and they fed off of one another, and fought against fascism, in Spain and Italy, effectively, and that's what. In Acid Communism, the Unfinished Essay by Fisher, it's sad that overall those groups weren't able to coalesce together and join and make something even better. Obviously not just the old labor movement and not just the hippie movement or whatever, but something that bridged those and fought for an end of labor exploitation, but also an expanded consciousness and awareness of new forms of reality, community, being in the world. A lot of that, what we've lamented about the left not having that community aspect, those countercultural movements did, and they need to be together in order for it to truly be meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Well, you want to highlight that as well, but I think that kind of thought is a good place to leave off. But if you want to just speak about this,
I think Fisher was, at least later in his life, was for the limit experience. I think. That's my reading. I could be wrong, but I think the limit experience as it is helpful to understand the outside, and that's what we need is the outside of capitalism. But yeah, be together. That's true.
I think it is, but I think there's a whole kind of like very cool, quite cliquey culture around around Fisher these days. But I mean around that kind of like left wing politics that links up with dance music and stuff. There's a whole kind of like too cool for school or just too cool for anything thing about it. I think like the actual thing itself of like limit experience, psychedelics, etc., how they might kind of play into a left movement, that's all very sound. But I just think that kind of protects itself so much from what community might mean in the wider sense, for most people in society. That it's just very difficult imagining how we might kind of put these things together.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway, that's why I think acid communism is brilliant, because at some point Fisher talks about working class holidays in, I think it was the 60s or 70s, and how they were possible. And he's talking just about family holiday, and you just think, well, okay, that's great, because he's not imagining this whole thing happening via kind of a new rave culture. He is acknowledging the need for like just simple basic things that families want and people want. So it has to happen on different levels. I'm sure like the whole acid culture thing is important, but I think we have to remember we're going to have to appeal to people from right across society. And then I think we can end on that note with what celebrity author says here, which is be together in real life. And that's just it. But it means all of us being together. And if we make a movement, it means we're going to need me and you to speak to people. Okay, we can connect with certain people. We have people still with us, listen to us now after an hour and a half. But who's going to go and talk to the housewives and the workers in the supermarkets? Okay, I mean, that's arguably Adam, you can also do that. But I mean, who's going to go and speak to basically everyone? So we need a big movement of people focusing on everyone. And some people feel threatened by that because they want to keep their kind of like, kind of cool and slightly kind of edgy acid communism to themselves. And I see a lot of that, and we're not going to do anything like that.
Yeah, no, very true.
So people who are inclined to being left are also more open-minded, so open to limit experiences, so be it drugs, or music, extreme sports, or whatever. Well, that's true. The trick is winning over those who aren't as much. Yeah, I believe so. But I mean, I think that the kind of things that happen when you're on drugs can happen anyway, or can happen through meditation in so many different ways. That an open-mindedness might require looking beyond the power of drugs into other things, also physical activities that can bring about certain states. So that last point is I think an important one we can finish with. Anyway, and I think we just had it highlighted, but we'll highlight it again. Can we do that? 100% left has to be open for everyone. I mean, that's what we're really about. Yeah. I don't like this kind of like we're too cool for you left that exists. Okay, so great. Let's meet again soon. We're back on Monday speaking to Conrad Hamilton about his new manifesto. So thank you for being here, and hope to see you then.
Peace.
Thank you. Bye-bye.